We'll talk about metaphysics. This by no means is exhaustive. There is too much to talk about. So before we begin, just some remarks on some of the books that are available. So an introductory book that deals with philosophical theology that does get into some of the metaphysics is Our Idea of God by Thomas Morris. It's an introduction to philosophical theology. I recommend this book. But recently, they published this 4 reviews book by Cascade. It's edited by Timothy Mosteller. And I would highly recommend Paul Gould, who teaches at Palm Beach Atlantic in Florida. Paul Gould has a chapter in here representing the Christian Platonist view in his modified theistic activism. This will be good because it goes into Platonism, Aristotelianism, idealism, and postmodernism. So 4 different views. I highly recommend Paul Gould. I'll refer to some of it in due time. And then last time I mentioned Paul Copan has a book that goes into some philosophical issues, and it is an introduction. And so does Cohen and Spiegel. So they have a book published by B&H, so I'd recommend that. But for an intermediate level, it's this giant, massive volume, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. It is J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig. It's published by InterVarsity Press. And I'd get the 2nd edition. I'd recommend this. And then if you take out a second mortgage, you can get Robert Coons and Chris Prigavent. He teaches at Biola. They have a volume called Atlas of Reality that gets into metaphysics. And that one is by far one of the most in-depth books on metaphysics. And they come from a neo-Aristotelian viewpoint. So that's really helpful. So those are going to be some resources to be able to dig into the metaphysics. Like I said, I really like Paul Gould. Paul Gould has another book that he published with, I think his name is Joseph Drew. It's an introduction to philosophy. I'd recommend that book as well. I think it's published by Baker. I think so. But, all right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about metaphysics. We've talked about epistemology, so I figured this would be an opportunity to speak about metaphysics. So metaphysics, we can get into the etymology of the term, but in philosophy, it's better to actually dig into the topics instead of trying to focus on definitions, because it's hard to give a precise definition. So typically, we would end up making lots of qualifications, and so we can only give a rough definition. So perhaps it's better to just dive right into it. And so we will do just that. Let me just pull up my notes here. All right. So some of the topics that we would dig into is existence. So existence. Existence. And then we'd talk about being. And then univocity versus analogy. And really we should talk about genus. And then what's the idea of an essence? and identity. And then properties. And then under properties, we would put abstract versus concrete. And then we'd get into substances. Which is going to be related to essence, right? Substances. And make sure that this is clear. Substances. And then we'd get into mereology. Not to get confused with Mariology. Mereology, which has to do with part-whole relations. And actually, I should put up here relations. Relations. And propositions. And concepts. And then when we cover all these things, we get into questions like, what's a person? And then when we deal with identity, personal identity through time. And then this gets into these deep debates on what is the nature of reality. In totality, what is the nature of reality? So then when we start dealing with these topics, we get into debates. So you get into these debates between realists. Depending upon what you answer on these, you're going to get into realism versus nominalism. And then, so realism versus nominalism. And then from that, you're going to get into another debate, which is going to be dualism versus monism. And there's two types of monism. So there's going to be like some sort of idealism, and then some sort of naturalism, or some type of physicalism. All right. So let's get into some of this. Obviously, there's too much here to cover, but there is a lot here. So we could first start off with what is existence. So sometimes we discuss existence in terms of thatness, that which is, thatness. And some people make a distinction between existence and essence. And so I'll first give you a definition that J.P. Moreland gives in terms of what is existence. I'm going to use his text a lot because it's intermediate, and so I find it helpful. So he defines existence. He says existence is either the belonging of some property or the being belonged to by a property, or more specifically, the entering into the nexus of exemplification. So that is to say, so existence is in which a property, he makes a distinction between it's the belonging of some property or the being belonged to by a property. So it's entering into the nexus of exemplification. That exemplification, so another term that they use is this idea of exemplification. Or instantiation. I may have misspelled that, but instantiation. So it's the idea that something there's a particular that it is there, right? And it is exemplified that it is, I think it's simpler to just define it as thatness, right? And it can come in different forms, right? But it's this idea that it is exemplified, it's instantiated, it is present in reality. Right? And again, that still doesn't clearly define what exactly we mean. But it's more than just so typically we talk about predication, instantiation, in which a thing exists as, right? And so when we use the term is, right, so if I say the dog exists, or the dog is brown, right? So if I say the dog is brown, this term is, this copula. The problem with our words is if we don't define what existence is, everything exists. And so you need to be clear on these types of statements are going to be more helpful when you're actually making a proposition and not a statement, right? And propositions are statements, but a proposition is going to have a subject and a predicate, and it's going to be clear. Whereas sometimes we make statements that don't actually tell us anything. And this term is very vague. I mean, anything exists. A dream exists. A person exists, right? But that doesn't tell us what exactly do we mean by exists. So what I'm simply saying is existence is, it is such a general term that we could say anything exists, right? And for the Greeks, they had some type of chain of being, and same with Aquinas, the analogia entis. And so they would see reality in terms of non-being, and then there's being, right? It's one of these two, right? You're either, you don't exist or you exist. And so in terms of existence, it's important that we define our terms, and then which brings us to this idea of being. So being, we say something, that thing right there, it exists. It has being, right? And that's where being and non-being. And Moreland makes this point, because Moreland is going to be the main one that does most of the metaphysics in this book. He makes a point that is being a genus, a category, right? A class. So he asks, is being a genus? And notice I put univocity versus analogy, or, yeah. So, is it analogical or is it univocal when it comes to being? Now, some will put this as posterior to being, not prior to being, right? And John Duns Scotus, he makes the point that before we even come to talking about being, we have to determine is it univocal or analogical in terms of, are we talking about the same thing? And Moreland makes a good point here. He says that we could say that things exist in the same sense, and we could look at different views about what exists itself, and he does that later in the book, but he says even though there are two different kinds of things that have existence, so even if something has a different kind of existence, so he gives an example of two types of things that exist, a heap and grain. And he asks, what's the difference between a heap and the grains? is it two distinct kinds of existence? So is there two qualitatively different things? He says probably not. To see this, we need to make a distinction between what it is to exist, existence in and of itself, on the one hand, and the different kinds of things that have existence on the other. We need not explain the heap and sand example by saying that there are two different kinds of existences involved. Rather, we can say that the heap and the grains both exist in the same sense, even though they are two different kinds of things that have existence. The heap is a dependent thing and has existence, and the grains are independent things that have existence. In short, the grains and the heap do not have different kinds of existence. Instead, they are different kinds of things that have existence. So the difference is, you don't have to think of beings in terms of qualitatively different. Instead, you could think of different kinds of things that have existence. So it would be univocal in the sense of saying that things exist. So really there's only a distinction between being and non-being, or existence. Something either has existence or it doesn't, much like pregnancy, right? You're either pregnant or you're not. You either have it or you don't. You either exist or you don't. Unicorns, we could say unicorns exist, but when we're using that term, we really mean, is it instantiated? Is it something that is in reality, right? Okay, so genus has to do with like a category or a class, right? And Moreland says that being, something existing, the thisness or the thatness, thisness or thatness of what something is, it needs to be univocal. It needs to have, there needs to be a category in which everything falls under in terms of existence, right? That doesn't mean to say that God becomes a creature, because God exists too. He has existence. He exists in reality. And God, we would say that God is original, and then he creates beings that are to reflect his being, right? And so there's still going to be there's going to be a distinction between the creator and the creature, right? To bring in theology here, that would be important. All right, so essence, we get into this idea of essence, the whatness. And in neo-Aristotelian metaphysics, Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle say that we can know the essence of something, right? We can know what something truly is in and of itself. And in essence, everything has an essence, a whatness, what something is. And this is typically taken as something that is primitive, that once you get to the core of what an essence is, there's nothing beyond that you can analyze about it. But you can have real definitions of essences. And so an example would be like a real definition of God. God would be, what would be the real essence, the real definition of God? Something like, and again, this is just kind of an example. So a tripersonal being of the divine kind, right? So, and we haven't talked about this idea of kind, but you can define an essence. You can use words to give a clear definition, a real definition of an essence. And there's nothing that you can go beyond what the essence of something is, the whatness of it. So typically when there's something is taken as primitive, something that you can't analyze beyond, it's something that it terminates in that real definition of what the essence of a specific thing is. Okay, and I'll leave it there. Now, what about identity? So we're familiar with this idea of transitivity in mathematics. Well, Leibniz talks about identity, and he's known for his identity of indiscernibles, his law. I won't go super deep into that. Okay, let's see here. Oh, I'm kind of backtracking here, but so here Moreland defines, he says, exemplification and predication and instantiating, it belongs to something. He says, consider the statement, tigers exist. This would assert the following. The property of being a tiger belongs to something, an individual tiger, say Tony. And the belonging relation, it has exemplification, predication, and instancing. The claim that tigers exist is the claim that the essence of being a tiger, the what of being a tiger, is actually exemplified by or belonging to something or fact of an individual tiger. So that tiger and the fact of that tiger existing. And then he goes on to further define, he says, we could break down the idea of tigers exist refers to the essence or nature of being a tiger, and 2, expressing reality or existence. And we learn 2 things from this. There's a difference between a thing's essence and its existence. Knowledge of what a tiger is does not tell us that tigers exist. And this is something that Kant makes the point about as well. So knowledge of a tiger does not tell us that the tiger exists. There's a fundamental difference between the essence, the whatness, and the existence, the thatness. And then the second point is existence is not a property that belongs, but is the belonging of a property. Let me make that point again. Existence is not a property that belongs, but is the belonging of a property. And then I can say this again. Existence is the entering into the predication or exemplification relation, and in general, the characteristics that I gave earlier are going to apply. So existence is a very important point in metaphysics, and so is being. Sometimes they use this term ontology. Ontology, ontos, existence. So it has to do, or being, and that's where we get this term ontological argument from. So it means being. Ontology. And it's sometimes made as a subcategory of metaphysics. All right. And I did mention this idea of non-being. Typically we'll talk about nothingness, right? Sometimes atheists use this term. Nothing means no thing, right? Nothingness has no properties, whatever. Things that do not exist have no properties. And he gives the example of Pegasus. We could think of the flying spaghetti monster. We could think of fictional characters, right? All right. That's helpful. So then we'll move back to identity. Sorry, I was backtracking here. So I talked about Leibniz's law of indiscernibles, of identicals. And so basically Leibniz makes the point that if something is identical, they're going to share everything. They're going to share everything. All the properties are going to be shared between the two. So the example would be, Superman is Clark Kent. Clark Kent is Superman. They're going to share all the same properties. Now, unless we start talking about Donald Baxter and the idea of having aspects, right, which we won't get into here, we're going to say that they are identical, right? And so Bruce Wayne is Batman, Batman is Bruce Wayne. So there's an identity relation. They share the same properties, so they are the same person, right? And there's an actual way in symbolic logic to make this point. Moreland uses an example. He says, any x and for any y, if they are identical to each other, then for any property p, p will be true of x, if and only if p is true of y. So everything is what it is and not something else. Everything is identical to itself and thus shares all properties in common with itself. And this implies a test for non-identity or difference. And we'll be able to individuate things as well. So Leibniz's law of the identity of indiscernibles. So in non-symbolic logic, this says that for all x and y, if x and y have all and only the same properties, then they are identical to each other. So it's very important to understand, what does identity mean? When is something the same and when is something different? And knowing identity is going to help clarify whether or not something is the same or different. And this is distinct from properties. So something can have properties that would individuate itself, right? So that it would be distinct. All right, let's continue. So we talked about identity. All right, so Moreland continues on. Then he starts talking about properties. So relation. So I didn't talk about relations. So relations is another. It's something that is related to properties, right? And something can have a relation. So a relation would be in which something stands related to something else. So stands by or is related to something. And so a relation is extremely important. So let's talk about some relations to try and help clarify what the concept is. So taller than, right? That's a relation. Bill is taller than Ted, right? Bill and Ted. So Bill is taller than Ted. So that's a relation in terms of height, right? But there could be relations that are not height. They can be ontological as well. You can have a dependence relation where X depends upon Y, right? So X depends upon Y. That's a relation. That's a dependence relation in which X and Y, one stands related to the other, right? And in theology, we talk about relations of origin, right? When we deal with the Trinity, theologians affirmed this idea of relations of origin. So relations of origin, it says that X eternally causes Y, right? So X eternally causes Y. So this would be an eternal causal relation, right? And X and Y, so we could say the Father eternally causes the Son, and the Father and Son eternally cause the Holy Spirit, right? So this would be a relation of causation, right? So relations is extremely important in metaphysics. There's different types of relations. Flexitive, symmetrical, dependence. There's a lot of different types of relations in metaphysics. And then properties. And the properties, this is where we get into this debate between realism and nominalism. How we understand properties. And Moreland goes into it. And Moreland does not cover some of the newer ideas. That's why I would recommend Robert Kuhn's book, The Atlas of Reality, because he's going to go way deeper. But there's truth maker theory, there's trope theory, and these are all going to be related to properties. I'm not going to get into any of that. We're just going to talk about we'll get into some of this abstract versus concrete. So, so typically when we think of abstract, and you know what, I'm going to use Paul Gould here because I like the way that he does it, and he's coming at it from a more Platonic and Aristotelian, a neo-Aristotelian background. So let's go into that. So he says right here, he says the contemporary Platonist thinks abstract objects exist, right? It's difficult to give a precise definition of abstract object. It is generally agreed to be immaterial, non-spatial, necessary, setting aside sets with contingent members, and eternal. And he says again, setting aside sets and perhaps fictional objects, and they're non-agents, so they're inert. They do not have causal powers typically in and of themselves. While abstract objects are typically thought to be causally impotent, which I said a moment ago, he says I allow that they can enter into causal relations and that some concepts and divine ideas play a formal causal role in divine creation. So he says that abstract objects are immaterial, non-spatial, necessary, and eternal. That's very helpful. Whereas concrete would be something that would be material, typically would be material, spatial, and contingent, and and I guess we could throw in wouldn't be eternal or everlasting. It would be temporal, and it would be temporal in a specific way in which there would be spatial and temporal. So it would be spatial and temporal in the sense that there would be probably temporal parts, perhaps. He doesn't go into any of that, but this is helpful. So this will be helpful to define the difference between abstract and concrete. And there, depending upon which view we talk about in terms of realism and nominalism, abstract can be referred to objects or entities. That's typically the term that is used. Entity. Entity is typically taken as like a substance. Entity, object. And I should probably put essence here. We want to use the term nature and kind. So dealing with certain types of nominalism, they're going to use the term abstract particulars. So abstract particulars cannot be possessed by more than one concrete particular. So a particular is a specific thing that exists, right? A specific thing that exists. So it's a precise and specified. It has specificity, if I'm even saying that word right. So it's specific, and it's an individual thing. So it's an individual thing, and he actually says that here. He says, nominalists accept the existence of properties, but hold that they are particular, individualized qualities called abstract particulars that cannot be possessed by more than one concrete particular. So there's different types of nominalism. There's extreme nominalism, and then there's the type of nominalism that we typically think of in terms of identifying differences, or I should do it the reverse. Identifying common properties that two things have in terms of similarity and not, or an abstraction in the mind. So some type of epistemic difference and not a metaphysical difference. Or I said difference. Let me say that again. When we have two objects, two substances, two things that exist, the nominalist will typically say that the reason why those two things are common, they share the same property. Like if you have two red apples, right? They're going to say, well, the reason why there's two red apples, the reason why we'd say that they're the same, it's not because there's this property of appleness or redness that is a metaphysically existing entity that's abstract, right? That's immaterial, non-spatial, and eternal. No, a nominalist is going to say, actually, what we do is we abstract this concept of apple and this concept of redness. And that's how we have this commonality. And the extreme nominalists are going to simply put it in terms of classifications, so that we put both of them in a class in which they both are members of that class. So the commonality is not an abstract entity or an abstract object. What makes them common is that they are particular, they're specific things, and they have abstract properties in the sense of epistemic abstraction. We abstract this idea of apple and this idea of redness, but they exist only in the mind and in the objects. There's nothing above it and beyond it. And it's similar to conceptualism, and perhaps maybe that is in fact what he's saying. Let's see here. Yeah, he says right here. He says, redness in general is a set of individual abstract particulars, that is, red 1, red 2, red, that are all concrete particulars, individual apples, spots, cars. Yeah, so that sounds about right. So he's saying that redness, there's different shades of red, and what's common is that we abstract in our minds a common or a generality of redness, or a generality of appleness. But there is nothing beyond our abstraction in our minds, if I understand him correctly. So I could be mistaken here. We could get into tropes too. Tropes are understood as modes. I won't get into that. Modes of being. He goes into so then he goes from nominalism to realism. So realism is going to be typically Neo-Aristotelianism and Platonism, but they're going to understand what is real differently. Here he has an interesting, he has some charts here. He says, do properties exist? Extreme nominalism says no, and then nominalism or realism says yes, properties do exist. Are properties universal or abstract particulars? So realism is going to say they're universals, and certain types of nominalism are going to say they're abstract particulars. So that there's something it's something that exists, and we abstract in our mind that there's something beyond what is physically or particularly instantiated in front of us, right? And so really the difference is there something that really exists beyond the red apple? Is there such a thing as redness and appleness? And if there is, then that would be realism. And if there's not, then it would be some type of nominalism. But some would make a different category of conceptualism. Right? And James and Anderson and Greg Welty has this idea of conceptual realism. Right? We're not going to be able to get into that, but conceptualism needs to be discussed as well. Moreland doesn't go into that here. So I didn't bring it here, but there's a 5 views book on abstract objects with Keith Yandell, Paul Gould, Greg Welty, and I think Graham Oppie. So that might be another book that's advanced to look into. And we've already seen a definition from Paul Gould. So Moreland makes the definition here. He says, an abstract entity or object is a real entity that is not in space or time. So it's immaterial and it's eternal. Something is in space if it has spatial or temporal duration and location. And then he makes the point, abstract entities have neither spatial or temporal location nor duration. Okay, same definition as Paul Gould. So then he goes into realism. I think we've defined realism pretty simply, is that realists believe that there are abstract objects and that abstract objects exist, and abstract objects are like numbers, propositions, colors, and these things, they are particularized in reality. So when we see a red apple, it has the property that belongs to it, which is going to be the color red, or it'll have that property of appleness, right? The essence of it, what it is, right? And these properties, which we'll define here shortly more, these properties, the abstract properties, they are immaterial, and they are eternal, and they're going to be exemplified in reality, right? And I'm just trying to think of examples, but I think the clearest way to think of these differences is just thinking of two objects. So you can think of ducks, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So 3 ducks. These 3 ducks. So the nominalist is going to say, well, there is no such thing as duckness. The reason why they share a common property is we have a genus, right? So we have this genus of duck. And so we've put these three ducks in the same category because they share similar properties, and so we put them in the same categories. And so then with words, we call each of them ducks. So duck 1, duck 2, duck 3, and for convenience, we just say they all 3 have this property of duckness, which is just in our minds, but it doesn't exist in reality. It doesn't exist outside of our minds. It is not an extramental reality. He goes into the axiom of localization. So as far as I understand, some realists do not think that abstract objects, this idea of multiple instantiation or multiple location. And then he talks about pure realists. So he talks about impure realists and pure realists. He says, impure realists accept properties as universals but rejects them as abstract objects. The pure realist claims that the best way of understanding what it means to say that properties are universals is to view them as abstract objects in the metaphysical sense. Nominalists are pure naturalists because they accept the axiom of localization. And the axiom of localization is no entity whatsoever can exist at different spatial locations at once or at interrupted time intervals. So nominalists reject the idea that a property can be multiply instantiated, that it can be multiply located, right? And in this case, impure realists affirm the same thing. Yeah, I believe so here. Yeah, they deny the axiom of localization. Okay. So Moreland goes through, and we've talked about this exact resemblance, and things in the world resemble or fail to resemble each other in various ways, and individuation, how to distinguish X and Y. but also how to show that X and Y are the same type of thing, right? So exact resemblance he discusses. Then he gets into substances. So we talked about abstract versus concrete. And they're using this term objects or entities. I don't like the term entity so much because sometimes they use the term entity as a property or they use it as a substance. And a property is something that a substance would bear. So we'll talk about that here, but a substance, so a substance is, so Moreland says that, he says properties have owners and a substance is the owner of properties. Substances have properties that are in them. Properties are had by the substances that possess them. And he gives the example, he says, Fido the dog has brownness, a certain shape, the property of weighing 25 pounds, and so on. These properties are present in Fido. In this sense, substances are more basic than properties. So it makes sense to ask about a property, what has that property? But it does not make sense to ask about a substance. For example, Fido, what has that substance? Right? So a bearer of properties, a substance, properties are in substances, but substances are basic in the way that they are not in or had by things more basic than them. Substances do the having, properties are had. And then he goes on to the etymology of the word. Substance, sub means under, stance means stand, thus substance means to stand under. It brings out this aspect of substance as that which stands under properties as their owner. And he makes a good point here, thinking of Neo-Aristotelian metaphysics. So the substance as a whole grounds its parts. It's not the other way around. The parts do not ground the substance or the whole. It's the reverse, that the whole grounds the parts or the properties. And so there's a unity of properties in a substance. A substance is also a unity of parts. So here he brings up a part. A part is a particular that would not survive if a substance having it were extinguished. And parts can be taken as proper or improper parts. The parts of a substance are united in such a way that the whole is prior to its parts in this sense. The parts of a substance are what they are in virtue of the role they play in the substance as a whole. Thus, the identity of a substance's parts presupposes the substance as a whole. The chamber of a heart is what it is in virtue of the role it plays in the heart as a whole. A heart is what it is in virtue of the role it plays in the circulatory system. The circulatory system is what it is in virtue of the role it plays in the organism as a whole. This is the famous example that Aristotle uses, and Gregory Fowler and Michael Baddendorf uses this point in their papers on divine simplicity as it's related to mereology, part-whole relationship. So he goes on, he talks about kinds, talks about the Aristotelian understanding of causality, efficient cause, material cause, formal cause, final cause, and individuation. And he talks about substances versus property things. Then he makes the point of a nature. Again, nature, essence are typically used synonymously. Talks about bundle theory, which is quite important when we Talk about David Hume and even John Locke and George Berkeley and Gordon H. Clark. All right, and then he gets into the mind-body problem, which is going to be related to all this. So Mariology, person, I mean, we could take a tangent, but so all the things that we've talked about, it brings us to this point in which we talk about what is the totality of reality. Is there two things? Is there the physical and the non-physical, right? So for whatever type of Platonism you have, you're going to have this abstract realm, right? There's going to be God, and then there's going to be this abstract realm that God created. And we'd have to get into theistic modified activism to explain how is it that God has properties and that he creates properties, and we won't be able to get into that. That's why I recommend Paul Gould's book here. But so you're going to have God, the triune God, right? Our triune God, he creates properties. He creates all of abstracta, all the cornucopia or plethora of the pleroma. That sounds very Gnostic, right? God creates this abstract realm. And as Gould goes on to say, in his view, he takes, I should make this point because this is going to be related. He says that, on his view, concepts are identified with divine ideas and propositions with divine thoughts. And so God uses these. Thinking is a productive activity, and so in thinking, God is the creator of concepts, divine ideas, and propositions, divine thoughts. And then he makes this point. Regarding those abstract objects that are proper parts or constituents of the divine nature, some exist as uncreated constituents, God's essential properties that are necessary in all possible worlds, and others as created constituents, either via an act of divine will, in the case of God's non-essential properties, or an act of divine thinking. Those abstract objects that exist distinct from God are created by God via an act of the divine will. So God creates everything that is non-divine. God creates, right? Because God's properties and God's parts are divine. They belong to Him. They're His, essentially and necessarily. But all those parts or properties that God creates, those are non-divine. Except in the case of the non-essential divine properties that God creates, right? And we can go into that, whether or not that's a supervenient relation or not. Is that really a property? That's a question for another time. But so God exists, and He creates this abstract realm, and this abstract realm is instantiated in the world, and we participate in the abstract realm. And so there's this participation ontology. And so that's going to be the dualism. So there's this abstract realm, which is going to be immaterial, and it's going to be eternal, and it's going to be abstract. It's going to be something that is, it's not physical, right? It's not physical. It's not spatial, right? It's not physical, it's not spatial, and it's eternal. And so you have these two realms. So you have a dualistic ontology, where you have the non-physical and the physical. Then you have monism, where there's two types of monism. There's either idealism or naturalism or physicalism. So monism, the idea of monos means one. So there's only one thing that exists, one type of thing. In all of reality, there's only one. And so there's famous views. So you have two famous views. You have George Barclay. Berkeley is the wrong pronunciation. George Berkeley. So George Berkeley, he was an idealist. He's going to say everything that exists is immaterial. There is no physical. Everything is immaterial. Everything, we use this term mind over matter, Well, everything exists is mind. There is no matter. Matter depends on mind. So there's a dependence relation. So everything in the end that exists is going to be immaterial. And then you have a different view, Spinoza. Benedict Spinoza, he says everything is physical. Everything is nature. Everything that exists is physical and nature, and that's all that everything is. And we can think of Democritus, who believed everything was made up of atoms, and that's all that exists. So these are two extremes of a type of monism. And we can go into some famous people that believed different one of these views. Let me go ahead and do that now. See here if I must have, let me see. Oh, give me a second. I'll grab my pen. I think I dropped it. Oh well. All right, I'll do it without a pen. Oh, here we go. Okay, so on idealism, some of the famous ones, as I said, is George Barclay. It's just the bad pronunciation is in my mind because of UC Berkeley, right? It's Barclay. So George Barclay, idealist. Jonathan Edwards, idealist. People that I like, Joshua Rasmussen, idealist. Joshua Ferris, idealist. So idealism, it's pretty popular within even Christian tradition. But dualism is going to be the consensus, I think, within Christian thought. So Christian philosophy, dualism is going to be the main view. Idealism, Gordon Clark seems to be an idealist as well. So I should bring him up as well. Naturalism, obviously if you're a naturalist, you think everything is physical. That would be incoherent if you think God is immaterial and then everything is physical. But there are people that believe that, which is really bizarre. In terms of realism, you got Thomas Aquinas, John Duns Scotus. I think Suarez would also be a realist. Could be mistaken on that. Nominalism, it's going to be William of Ockham is going to be famous for some sort of nominalism. All right. And then person. What's a person? Well, so David Hume says a person is a bundle of perceptions. And Gordon H. Clark says a person is a proposition, right? Or a bundle of propositions. And in Christian tradition, some say that a person is a relation or a mode. And then others are going to say, well, no, it's not a relation. A person is something more than that, right? Something more than just a mere relation. But, I mean, proposition, a relation. So what is a person? Well, a person typically is taken as an individual substance of a concrete nature. And Boethius uses this term, he says that a rational animal or a rational nature. Right? Well, that's true. But we could think of cases where someone is a person and yet they don't have the ability to exercise their rationality, right? And I know that we think of cases where someone, for whatever reason, has brain damage. So rationality, it seems like it must be a capacity that you have, but you may not be able to exercise it, right? And so we typically say an intellect, will, and some say emotions. So intellect, volition, and emotions, depending upon who it is. But sometimes people make the point of consciousness, right? And again, we can think of people that get in an accident and they're not conscious, right? But even a person, we say a human being, right? So a human being. So we use the term being and human, of a human kind, something that. So think of an essence of a human being. It's something that exists of a human kind, right? X of a human kind. And typically they have the capacity of rationality, of volition, but they may not be able to exercise it for whatever reasons, right? And so we have to think of those counterfactuals. Or perhaps maybe it's, different, okay. But yeah, we typically think of intellect, will, emotions. We talk about consciousness, self-consciousness, self-knowledge. I think that's extremely important, self-knowledge. But there are situations where we'd still say something is a human being that may not have, well, this gets into epistemology, so I won't get into that. But epistemology and metaphysics are going to be inextricably linked. So if you're doing one, you're going to do the other. You can't really do one without the other. I pray that this was a blessing to you. Peace and God bless.